Hey everyone. Tonight we're diving deep into the shimmering, sandy past, searching for whispers of a treasure so immense it supposedly broke economies just by passing through. Imagine, if you will, the sun setting over the vast Sahel, that wide ribbon of land just south of the Sahara. Dust devils dance in the fading light, the air cools, and the stars begin to prick the darkening sky, just as they did centuries ago. You're looking out over an expanse that once cradled an empire dripping with gold, an empire whose ruler's wealth is still, to this day, almost impossible to truly comprehend. We're talking about the Mali Empire, and specifically the legendary, almost mythical, lost gold of its emperors. Now, think about your last big online purchase. A bit stressful, right? Imagine trying to manage a kingdom where your primary export is so valuable, so coveted, that entire nations shift their gaze towards you. You probably wouldn't have survived the sheer administrative headache of it all, let alone the camelback commute. So, before you get too comfortable and drift off into dreams of golden caravans, take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. It really does help the channel out. And while you're at it, feel free to share your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from as we explore these quiet corners of history together. Now turn off your lights, turn on your fan for some gentle white noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on sun-baked earth, the air thick with the scent of dust and distant wood smoke. It's the early 13th century, a time of upheaval and rebirth in West Africa. The old Ghana Empire, a powerful entity in its own right, has faded, its control over the lucrative trans-Saharan trade routes weakening, like an old man's grip. This trade, a constant flow of salt from the north for gold from the south, is the lifeblood of this region. You can almost hear the faint, rhythmic clinking of gold. Not yet the mountains of legend, but enough to spark ambition, enough to build kingdoms. In this power vacuum, smaller kingdoms and chieftaincies vie for dominance. One of these is the Soso Kingdom, led by a formidable and reportedly cruel sorcerer king, Sumaoro Kante. His name is whispered with a mixture of fear and awe. He's a figure of immense power, said to possess magical bolafons and to have defeated 9 kings whose heads he supposedly kept in his chambers. Probably not the kind of interior decorating you'd feature on an episode of Sahelian Homes, let's be honest. You can almost feel the oppressive weight of his rule, the fear that ripples through the villages. His warriors are fierce, his ambition boundless. He crushes his rivals, consolidating his power, and the land groans under his rule. But change is coming, carried on the whispers of prophecy and the quiet determination of a young man named Sundiata Keita. You see him, perhaps not as a mighty warrior at first, but as an underdog. Legend woven into the vibrant threads of the Epic of Sundiata tells us he was a sickly child, unable to walk for many years. He was an object of scorn, his mother, Sogolon Konde, ridiculed. Imagine the frustration, the quiet observation from a seated position, watching the world move while you remain still. This period of perceived weakness, however, might have been a crucible, forging an iron will. It's a classic tale, isn't it? The rejected stone becoming the cornerstone, Historians still debate the full extent of these early biographical details, sifting through the rich layers of oral tradition to find the kernel of historical fact. Was his lameness a literal affliction, or perhaps a metaphor for a period of Manda subjugation before his rise? The griots, the keepers of history and story in West Africa, sing of these times with a lyrical authority that often blurs the line between myth and documented event. One day, so the epic goes, shamed by an insult to his mother, Sundiata rises. Not just rises, but stands tall and strong, a baobab sapling suddenly revealing its destiny to become a giant. He pulls an iron rod from the earth, or in some versions, an entire baobab tree, and walks. This moment, symbolic or literal, marks the beginning of his ascent. You feel a shift in the air, a current of hope stirring against the oppressive rule of Sumauro. Sundiata is exiled, a common trope for future heroes, isn't it? You follow him in your mind's eye as he journeys through neighboring kingdoms, gathering allies, learning the arts of war and diplomacy. He's charismatic, this young man. He has a vision not just of defeating Sumaro, but of uniting the Mande peoples, the various groups speaking related languages in this region, into something new, something stronger. He's not just building an army, he's weaving a tapestry of alliances. You can almost hear the murmur of different dialects, the clatter of various weapons as his coalition grows. Some historians point to his ability to incorporate different clans and their totems into his burgeoning state as a key to his success, a kind of early federalism. The inevitable confrontation arrives around the year 1235 at a place called Kirina. Imagine the scene: the dust rising from thousands of marching feet, the sun glinting off spear points and iron swords. On one side, So Mauro, confident in his power, perhaps even his sorcery. On the other, Sundiata, leading a confederation hungry for freedom. The battle is fierce. The griots sing of magical duels, of arrows that find their mark through supernatural means. One particularly intriguing, though perhaps apocryphal detail, is that Sundiata discovered Sumaro's Tana, his magical taboo or weakness, which was contact with the spur of a white rooster. An arrow tipped with such a spur or a spear is said to have grazed Sumaro, robbing him of his power. He flees, defeated, his dominion shattered. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief, the roar of victory from Sundiata's forces. It's a pivotal moment, the birth of an empire. With Sumaro vanquished, Sundiata Keita, also known as Mari Jata, or even the Lion King, yes, centuries before Disney, though the parallels are more coincidental than direct, establishes the Mali Empire. He chooses the town of Niani as his capital, though its exact location is another point of friendly scholarly disagreement, with several sites along the Sankarani River proposed. Imagine the bustling activity of a new capital being established, the sounds of construction, the arrival of envoys from allied clans, the organization of a new administration. It's not just about conquest, it's about building. Sundiata is credited with establishing the Kurukan Fuga, a sort of oral constitution for the new empire. It allegedly outlined social organization, rights, responsibilities, and laws. Think of it as an early charter of liberties, passed down not through dusty scrolls, but through the powerful memory and voices of the griots. It divided the Mande peoples into clans assigning specific roles: warriors, artisans, and, of course, the griots themselves. This social structuring, while perhaps rigid by our modern standards, provided a framework for stability and cohesion in a diverse and sprawling territory. You might find yourself wondering how well you'd fit into such a system. Would you be a skilled leather worker, a brave warrior, or perhaps a somewhat sarcastic historian, quietly observing from the sidelines? Now, let's talk about the gold. Sundiata doesn't just conquer, he secures the all-important gold fields. The regions of Bambouk, Bura, and Galam, nestled in the lands south of Niani, are rich with alluvial gold. You can picture the scene: people patiently sifting through river gravel, the sun beating down, the glint of a tiny fleck of gold rewarding hours of labor. It's not mined in deep shafts initially, but rather collected from riverbeds and surface deposits. This gold is the engine of the new empire. Sundiata organizes its extraction and, crucially, its trade. He doesn't just control the source, he controls its path north, across the vast and unforgiving Sahara, to the markets of North Africa, and from there to Europe and the Middle East. The amount of gold starting to flow isn't yet the legendary world-altering flood that will come with later emperors, particularly Mansa Musa. But Sundiata lays the foundation. He creates the stability and organization necessary for this wealth to be systematically exploited and managed. You could say he built the vault before it was completely filled. There's a strange detail sometimes mentioned in old texts about a silent trade for gold, particularly in earlier periods in West Africa, where Berber traders would leave their goods, like salt, at a designated spot, retreat, and the local gold miners would come, take the goods if the amount was acceptable, and leave a corresponding amount of gold. Then the Berbers would return. This minimized direct contact, perhaps due to language barriers or a desire to protect the location of the mines. Whether this practice was still widespread or relevant to Mali's core goldfields under Sundiata is debated, but it's a fascinating glimpse into the cautious, almost ritualistic nature of this precious commodities exchange. The early Mali Empire under Sundiata is a place of consolidation. He has united disparate groups, established a system of governance, and secured the economic engine of gold. You can sense a new confidence in the land, a feeling of belonging to something large and significant. The horrors of Sumauro's reign are receding into memory, replaced by the legends of the Lion King. The gold is there, not yet lost, but being carefully gathered, traded, and used to build the power and prestige of this new West African giant. The caravans are moving, the merchants are prospering, and the name of Mali is beginning to be whispered in the far-off markets of the Mediterranean. The systems Sundiata put in place were designed for longevity. He wasn't just a warlord, he was an architect of a state. He understood that true power came not just from the spear, but from organization, from trade, and from a shared identity. One of the mainstream historical facts often emphasized is the sheer size and longevity of the Mali Empire, which at its peak would stretch for over 1,000 miles from the Atlantic coast to beyond the Niger Bend. It encompassed diverse peoples and climates, from savanna to Sahel. Imagine the logistical challenges: communication across vast distances, managing different ethnic groups, ensuring the loyalty of provincial governors. It's a testament to Sundiata's foundational work that it held together and prospered for centuries. A slightly more unusual detail from this period, or connected to the Mand worldview, is the importance of blacksmiths. In many West African cultures, blacksmiths were, and in some places still are, regarded with a mixture of respect and apprehension. They were masters of fire and iron, transforming earth into tools and weapons. They were often considered to possess special spiritual powers, acting as healers, diviners, and mediators. This reverence for blacksmiths, who were crucial for both agriculture and warfare, likely played a significant role in the technological and military capabilities of the nascent empire. You wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of the blacksmiths' guild. They probably knew things, and not just about metal. As Sundiata's reign progresses, the empire solidifies. The foundations are strong. The gold is flowing, though its true global impact is yet to be seen. The mystery of the lost gold isn't a mystery yet because it's still being methodically accumulated. The bedrock of an empire on the rise. You feel a sense of order being established, a rhythm to life under the Lion King. The trade routes are becoming more defined, the markets more organized. The wealth isn't just in the gold itself, but in the control of its passage, the taxes levied, the goods it attracts in return. Salt, Kaneshno, but also horses, cloth, copper, and manufactured items. The scholarly debate that often surfaces regarding Sundiata's era, beyond the specifics of his biography or the capital's location, concerns the nature and speed of Islam's adoption within the Mali elite and broader population. While North African traders had been introducing Islam to West Africa for centuries, and rulers of Ghana had Muslim advisors, the extent to which Sundiata himself and his immediate court were devout Muslims versus practitioners of traditional Manda religion, or a syncretic blend, is complex. Griot traditions often emphasize his connection to Mande spiritual powers, while Arab chroniclers later tend to portray the Mali rulers as staunchly Muslim. It's likely a gradual process, with rulers adopting Islam for diplomatic and commercial advantages, while much of the population retained traditional beliefs for a long time. Picture the subtle cultural negotiation, the blending of old and new faiths, the prayers offered to Allah alongside respects paid to local spirits of the land and river. This religious landscape is another layer to the intricate society Sundiata was building. He needed to be a king for all his people, regardless of their specific spiritual leanings. It's a delicate balancing act, one that many rulers throughout history have had to manage. Perhaps he was a pragmatist, understanding the unifying power of Islam in the context of trans-Saharan trade, while still respecting the ancestral traditions of his people. This flexibility would have been a strength. The air in Niani, as you imagine it, is now less about the harshness of survival and more about the hum of a growing imperial center. You can almost smell the roasting meat in the markets, hear the chatter of merchants in various tongues, the rhythmic beat of a blacksmith's hammer, the distant sound of a griot's kora accompanying a song of Mali's founding. The gold is there under guard in royal treasuries, a shimmering promise of the immense wealth to come. It's the seed capital for an empire that will soon astonish the world. The sun begins to dip lower, casting long shadows. The day's work is ending, but for the Mali Empire, its golden age is just beginning to dawn. The first act of its story under Sundiata is one of creation and consolidation, setting the stage for the incredible riches and the enduring mystery that will follow. You feel a sense of anticipation, knowing that this carefully gathered gold will soon embark on a journey that will make it legendary and then elusive. The legacy of Sundiata, the Lion King, settles over the land like the cool embrace of the evening. His successors, the Mansas who follow, mostly continue his work, expanding the empire's borders, strengthening its administration, and, of course, overseeing the ever increasing flow of that precious sun colored metal. You can imagine these intervening years as a slow, steady accumulation, like a river gradually widening and deepening. The gold isn't just sitting in vaults, it's lubricating the wheels of a vast internal economy and a far reaching external trade. Salt still comes south, cola nuts travel north and east, and the markets of Niani and increasingly other cities like Timbuktu and Jenne buzz with commerce. Each Mansa adds a little more to the imperial treasury, a little more to the prestige of Mali. There are, of course, the usual palace intrigues, the jockeying for power that seems to be a standard feature of any royal court, whether it's in medieval England or 13th century Mali. You might picture whispered conversations in lamplit chambers, alliances forming and fracturing like clay pots. One Mansa, a particularly notorious one named Khalifa, was said to be mad and would shoot arrows at his subjects for sport from the palace roof. Thankfully, his reign was short lived. You probably wouldn't want to be his royal target practice supervisor. His story is a brief, dark blip, a reminder that not all who inherit power wield it wisely. Historians sometimes debate whether these accounts of mad rulers are entirely accurate or perhaps political propaganda from successors aiming to legitimize their own claims. It's hard to get a clear HR report from the 14th century. Then, as the 13th century melts into the 14th, a new figure emerges, one whose name will become almost synonymous with unimaginable wealth: Mansa Musa. He comes to the throne around 1312. His ascent isn't entirely straightforward. One fascinating, though debated account tells of his predecessor Mansa Muhammad ibn Ku, or perhaps another ruler named Abu Bakr II or Abu Bakari II. This Mansa, so the story goes, became obsessed with the idea of an ocean at the edge of the world, the Great Atlantic. He supposedly equipped a vast fleet of ships, hundreds of them, filled with men, gold, water, and provisions, and set off to explore this western sea, instructing his captains not to return until they had found its end or had run out of supplies. Only one ship, the story claims, eventually returned, its captain telling of a great current or river in the ocean that swept the other ships away. Undeterred, the Mansa then supposedly equipped an even larger fleet, placed himself at its head, and sailed off into the unknown, never to be seen again. Musa, who had been appointed his deputy, then ascended to the throne. Now, scholars are deeply divided on this tale of the Atlantic voyage. Some see it as a credible, if sparsely documented, early attempt at transatlantic exploration, predating Columbus by nearly 2 centuries. Others view it as a later embellishment, a romantic legend. There's no definitive archaeological proof, no Malian ships found on American shores. But imagine the sheer audacity, the ambition. If true, it paints a picture of a Mali that wasn't just a land based empire focused on desert trade, but one with rulers gazing out at the vast, mysterious ocean, wondering what lay beyond. It also makes for a rather convenient way for Musa to become Mansa. His boss literally sailed off the edge of the known world. He's just popped out to discover the Atlantic. I'm in charge now. Is a pretty solid claim to power. So Mansa Musa is now on the throne. You see him as a man in his prime, a devout Muslim, and a ruler with a keen understanding of the power of his empire's wealth, not just as a means of exchange, but as a tool of diplomacy and international prestige. For the first decade or so of his reign, he consolidates his power, perhaps expands Mali's territories further, ensuring the smooth operation of the gold mines and the trade routes. The gold continues to flow, a glittering river pouring into the imperial coffers. The empire is stable, prosperous, and largely unknown to the wider medieval world beyond North Africa. But Mansa Musa is about to change that dramatically. Around 1324, he decides to undertake the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, a sacred duty for all able Muslims. But this is no ordinary pilgrimage. This is a Mansa of Mali on the move, and he's not exactly traveling light. You have to picture the preparations. This isn't a weekend trip. It's a journey of thousands of miles across the Sahara Desert, through Egypt and into Arabia. The logistics alone are staggering. Imagine the imperial planners, the quartermasters, the officials, all scurrying about, a flurry of activity that probably made organizing a modern music festival look like a walk in the park. The caravan that assembles is legendary. Chroniclers of the time, especially those in Cairo who witnessed its arrival, struggled to capture its scale. Accounts speak of 60,000 men. Yes, 60,000. This includes soldiers for protection, civilian attendants, officials, camel drivers, and of course, an enormous personal retinue for Musa himself. His senior wife, Inari Conte, reportedly traveled with 500 attendants of her own. Imagine the sheer amount of food and water required. It's like moving a small city. And then there are the animals. Thousands of camels, horses, and other pack animals. You can almost hear the cacophony. The braying of camels, the shouts of men, the creak of leather, the rhythmic thud of countless feet and hooves. And the gold. Oh, the gold! This is where the story enters the realm of the truly astounding. According to the Arab historian al-Umari, who visited Cairo some years after Musa's passage, but spoke to many who had witnessed it, Musa brought with him an incredible quantity of gold. Some sources say 80 to 100 camel loads, each camel carrying up to 300 pounds of gold dust. That's potentially 30,000 pounds of gold, or even more. Others say his personal entourage of slaves, perhaps numbering 12,000, each carried a staff made of solid gold. You are trying to picture this procession snaking its way across the desert, a glittering river of humanity and wealth. The sun reflecting off all that gold, making it shimmer and dance in the heat haze. It must have been an almost blinding sight, a spectacle unlike anything seen before or since. You can almost feel the dry desert air, taste the grit of sand, and see that golden river moving slowly but inexorably eastward. One popular anecdote, a detail that really sticks in the historical imagination, is about his generosity, or perhaps his financial naivety on a grand scale. As he traveled, especially once he reached more populated areas like Cairo, Mansa Musa gave away gold lavishly. He bestowed gifts upon dignitaries, scholars, and merchants. He gave alms to the poor. He spent enormous sums in the markets, buying goods, souvenirs, and perhaps even slaves, a common practice of the time, unfortunately. He was, by all accounts, incredibly open handed. If he liked a particular carpet, he didn't haggle, he paid in gold. If he admired a scholar, he'd shower him with gold. It was, in a way, the ultimate power move. Here was a ruler from deepest Africa, a land many in the Middle East probably considered peripheral, demonstrating wealth that dwarfed their own. He was putting Mali on the map, not with armies, but with sheer economic might. When Mansa Musa arrived in Cairo, his entourage and his spending caused an economic sensation. The Sultan of Egypt at the time, Al Nasser Muhammad, was a powerful ruler in his own right. But even he was reportedly astonished by the Malian Mansa's largesse. There's a famous story about Musa initially refusing to prostrate himself before the Sultan, as protocol dictated, saying he would only prostrate himself before Allah. Eventually, a compromise was reached, or Musa relented, but it showed his sense of his own status. He was no mere vassal. He met with scholars, officials, and merchants, and his impact was profound. He pumped so much gold into the Cairene economy through gifts, purchases, and alms that he reportedly depressed the value of gold in the city for over a decade. Imagine that. You give away so much money that money itself becomes less valuable. It's the kind of economic disruption that makes modern central bankers wake up in a cold sweat. This specific documented impact on Cairo's gold market is a key mainstream historical fact that underscores the sheer volume of wealth Musa dispersed. You can picture the markets of Cairo, usually bustling, now absolutely frenzied. Merchants, money changers, ordinary folk all scrambling for a piece of this Malian gold. Prices for goods likely skyrocketed temporarily as this new purchasing power flooded in, and then the value of gold itself dipped. It's a classic example of supply and demand, writ incredibly large. Some scholars argue that the economic disruption wasn't just a temporary blip, but had longer lasting consequences for the regional gold trade, though the exact extent is naturally a subject of ongoing discussion. Did he intend to cause this? Probably not. He was likely demonstrating his piety and generosity, as expected of a great king on Hajj, but perhaps on a scale no one, maybe not even he, fully anticipated the consequences of. You might wonder if he had a particularly astute financial advisor who was tearing his hair out, or if everyone was just too caught up in the golden wave. Sire, perhaps a little less gold for the pigeon feed seller. The journey to Mecca continued, equally spectacular, one assumes. He performed the rites of Hajj, no doubt making a huge impression there as well. And then came the return journey. This is where things get a little murkier and more interesting for our lost gold theme. Having spent so extravagantly, Some accounts suggest that Mansa Musa actually ran out of ready cash on the way back, or at least found his reserves seriously depleted. He reportedly had to borrow money at high interest from merchants in Cairo to finance his return trip. Imagine the irony, the man who single handedly devalued gold now needing to borrow it. It's like a billionaire needing a payday loan to get his private jet refueled. This detail, if accurate, adds a fascinating layer to his story. It suggests that even his almost incomprehensible wealth had its limits, or at least the portion he brought with him did. Did all that gold just vanish into the markets of Egypt and Arabia? A significant portion certainly did. It was spent, gifted, exchanged. It entered circulation, boosting economies, paying for goods and services, and eventually trickling into treasuries and merchant coffers across the Middle East and then into Europe. This is, in one sense, how the gold became lost to Mali. It was disseminated. It wasn't like he buried a chest of it in the desert. He invested it, albeit in a very public and flamboyant way, into Mali's international reputation. But the Hajj wasn't just about spending gold. It was also about acquiring knowledge and talent. Mansa Musa was deeply impressed by the architecture, scholarship, and culture he encountered, particularly in Egypt. On his return journey, he brought back with him scholars, architects, and artisans. One of the most famous was the Andalusian poet and architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, also known as Es-Saheli, who is credited with designing several prominent buildings in Mali, including the great Djinguereber Mosque in Timbuktu and parts of the royal palace. You can imagine Musa, his gold somewhat depleted but his mind full of new ideas, eager to transform his own cities into great centers of learning and Islamic culture. He paid al-Sahili handsomely, reportedly giving him 200 kilograms of gold for his work. So some of the gold came back, not as bullion, but transformed into architectural and intellectual capital. The construction of these new mosques and madrasas, especially in Timbuktu and Jenne, marks a golden age of Islamic scholarship in West Africa. Timbuktu, in particular, became a renowned center of learning, with its Sankore University attracting students and scholars from across the Islamic world. Libraries were filled with manuscripts on theology, law, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. This intellectual flourishing, funded by Malian gold, is another crucial legacy of Musa's reign. It's a reminder that wealth can be used not just for ostentation, but for lasting cultural development. The image of Timbuktu as a remote, almost mythical place often overshadows its reality as a vibrant intellectual hub. You wouldn't just find camels there, you'd find heated debates about Aristotelian philosophy. Now, how does this spectacular display and dispersal of wealth tie into the mystery of lost gold? Firstly, the Hajj itself broadcast Mali's riches to the world. Before Musa's journey, Mali was a relatively obscure kingdom to Europeans. After it, stories of this fabulously wealthy African king spread like wildfire. Catalan mapmakers in the 14th century began to depict Musameli or Mansa Musa on their charts, often shown holding a golden orb or scepter. The famous Catalan Atlas of 1375 has a prominent depiction of him. This put a giant golden target on Mali's back, metaphorically speaking. Everyone now knew where the gold was coming from. You can bet that more than a few European and North African rulers started thinking about how they might get a share of that wealth. Secondly, the sheer amount spent raises questions about sustainability. Could Mali continue to produce and spend gold at such a rate? While the mines were productive, was this level of expenditure repeatable? Or was the Hajj a once in a lifetime display, a massive outflow that significantly reduced the accumulated royal treasury? Historians still debate the long term economic health of Mali after Musa. Did his spending stimulate trade and connections that brought further wealth? Or did it set a precedent for lavishness that the empire later struggled to maintain? A weird or sidelight detail related to the gold itself is how it was perceived. For the people of Mali, gold was valuable, certainly, but it wasn't the only measure of wealth. Salt, for instance, was sometimes considered almost as precious given its necessity in the Sahelian climate. Control over the salt trade from mines like Tahaza in the Sahara was as strategically important as control over the gold fields. It makes you think about perceived value. What is truly precious? Is it the glittering metal or the humble mineral that keeps you alive? Probably depends on whether you're trying to impress a foreign sultan or just trying to get through a hot afternoon. Furthermore, tracking such vast sums of gold once dispersed is incredibly difficult. Gold is fungible. It gets melted down, recoined, incorporated into jewelry, and moved across continents. The gold Musa spent in Cairo didn't stay in Cairo. It flowed along trade routes, becoming part of a much larger global economic system. So, lost doesn't necessarily mean hidden in a secret cave. It means absorbed into the world's economy, its Malian origins gradually forgotten by those who later possessed it. You can imagine a gold coin, originally mined by a worker in Bouré, passing through Musa's hands, then to a Cairene merchant, then perhaps to a Venetian trader, then to a European banker. Its journey untraceable. The scholarly debate here could focus on the true extent of Timbuktu's literary and scientific output compared to other major centers of the Islamic world, like Cordoba, Baghdad, or Cairo at their respective peaks. While undeniably significant for West Africa and a vital repository of Islamic learning, was it a leading center of original scientific discovery on a global scale, or more a center of dedicated scholarship, preservation, and teaching? The answer likely lies somewhere in between, with notable original contributions in some fields, like Islamic jurisprudence and history, alongside the vital work of transmitting and adapting knowledge from elsewhere. It's a nuanced discussion, avoiding both Eurocentric dismissal and romanticized exaggeration. Mansa Musa's reign continued for some years after his return, until his death around 1337. He left behind an empire that was larger, more internationally renowned, and more culturally developed than ever before. He had literally put Mali on the world map. You feel the empire at its zenith, a sprawling, wealthy, and intellectually vibrant state. The Niger River flows like a life-giving artery through its heartland. Cities like Timbuktu, Janneh, and Gao are bustling centers of trade and learning. The Mansa's court is a place of splendor, attended by scholars, officials, and foreign envoys. The gold is still there, still being mined, still driving the economy. Yep, but the seeds of its eventual loss or dispersal are also sown. The world now knows about Mali's wealth. The very act of showcasing it so spectacularly has made it a more tempting prize. And the internal dynamics of managing such wealth and such a vast, diverse empire are complex. Successors to Musa would face significant challenges. You get a sense that this peak, this golden moment, is magnificent, but perhaps precarious, like standing on the summit of a very high mountain. The view is incredible, but the winds are strong, and the way down can be treacherous. The mystery of the lost gold isn't just about where a specific hoard went, it's about how this colossal fortune, which defined an era, eventually faded from Molly's direct control, becoming a legend whispered down through the centuries. The gold is still out there in a way, but it has embarked on a new journey, leaving behind the empire it once defined. The air is rich with the scent of prosperity, but there's a faint, almost imperceptible hint of future storms on the horizon. The echoes of Mansa Musa's grand Hajj, that breathtaking display of wealth and piety, reverberate for years, even decades. You can imagine the stories told and retold, from the bustling markets of Cairo to the scholarly halls of Fez, perhaps even reaching the ears of Genoese merchants planning their next ventures. Mali is firmly on the world stage, a glittering jewel in the African crown. But as with all great empires, the peak is often followed by a slow, almost imperceptible descent. Before things gather a more obvious downward momentum, it's like watching a magnificent sunset. The most brilliant colors eventually fade into dusk. Mansa Musa's son, Magun inherits the throne around 1337. He has big sandals to fill, or perhaps big golden amulets to wear. You get the sense that Magan is, well, not quite his father. Accounts suggest he was a less forceful ruler, perhaps more inclined to enjoy the splendors of the court than the rigorous demands of imperial administration. Some chronicles hint at a profligate reign, one where the carefully managed treasury of Musa began to be spent with less foresight. It's not that the gold suddenly vanishes, but rather that the outflow perhaps starts to exceed the inflow, or at least the strategic reinvestment that characterized Musa's later years. It's like the heir to a massive fortune who starts buying too many jewel-encrusted falcons without checking the account balance. You can almost hear the faint, distant sound of coins clinking a little too freely. Then comes Mansa Suleiman, Musa's brother, who takes over around 1341. He's often portrayed as a more capable and austere ruler, a sort of corrective to Meg Han's alleged extravagances. You can picture him trying to tighten the imperial purse strings, reasserting control, and maintaining the dignity and power of the Mansa. Al-Umari, the same chronicler who gave us vivid details of Musa's Hajj, based on Cairene accounts, also provides information from a visitor to Mali during Suleiman's reign. This visitor, Ibn Battuta, the famous Berber traveler, actually journeyed through the Mali Empire extensively around 1352 to 1353, offering us a rare first-hand glimpse. Ibn Battuta's accounts paint a picture of a still vast, powerful, and remarkably safe empire. He speaks of the security of the roads. You could travel for months without fear of bandits. He describes the piety of the people, the well-attended Friday prayers, the children chained until they could recite the Quran. A rather extreme educational method, you might think. Probably not one you'd see endorsed by modern parenting gurus. He also notes the richness of the court the elaborate ceremonies, and the Mansa's displays of wealth, though perhaps not on the same intercontinental scale as Musa's Hajj. He mentions, for instance, an audience with Mansa Suleiman, where the Mansa was seated on a grand platform, shaded by a silken umbrella topped with a golden bird, surrounded by dignitaries and musicians. This is still a major power. One mainstream historical fact, often highlighted from Ibn Battuta's travels, is his observation of the existing bureaucratic efficiency and the deep respect for law and order within Mali's core territories. However, Ibn Battuta also provides hints of underlying tensions. He mentions court intrigues and rivalries. He recounts a story of Suleiman's principal wife, Kasa, conspiring against him, though the plot was discovered. Such internal frictions are often the first cracks to appear in the facade of a mighty empire. You can sense that while the surface remains impressive, the foundations might be experiencing subtle shifts. The scholarly debate around Ibn Battuta's account often revolves around its objectivity and completeness. He was, after all, a guest of the Mansa and might have been shown what the court wanted him to see, or he might have interpreted events through his own cultural lens. Did he fully grasp the complexities of Mande political culture, or did he sometimes misunderstand local customs? It's a perennial question when dealing with travelers' tales from distant lands and times. As the 14th century wears on, the challenges for Mali begin to mount. The empire is vast, stretching from the Atlantic in the west to the lands beyond Gao and Timbuktu in the east, encompassing diverse peoples with their own traditions and ambitions. Managing such an entity requires strong central leadership, loyal provincial governors, and a robust military. When any of these elements weaken, things can start to unravel. You can almost feel the immense strain of holding it all together, like trying to keep a dozen unruly horses pulling in the same direction. One of the first major blows comes from within, or rather from a powerful vassal state that begins to assert its independence. The Songhai people, centered around the strategically important trading city of Gao on the Niger Bend. Gao had been part of the Mali Empire, a crucial hub for trans-Saharan trade, but its rulers, the Sunni dynasty, begin to flex their muscles. They start raiding Malian territory, eventually breaking free and laying the foundations for what will become the next great Sahelian empire, the Songhai Empire. You can imagine the Mansas and Niani receiving reports of these rebellions, the frustration, the dispatch of armies that are perhaps less effective than they once were. Each successful rebellion chips away at Mali's territory, its resources, and its prestige. Then there are the external threats. From the south, the Mossi horsemen, from the kingdoms in what is now Burkina Faso, launch damaging raids into Mali's southern territories. They are fierce warriors, and their incursions disrupt trade and agriculture. You can picture the panic in villages as news of Mossi raiders approaches, the smoke rising from looted settlements. From the north, the Tuareg, nomadic Berber peoples of the Sahara, experts in desert warfare, begin to exert more pressure on cities like Timbuktu and Walata. Timbuktu, that jewel of Islamic learning and trade, is particularly vulnerable. It's captured by the Tuareg for a period in the mid-15th century, a significant blow to Mali's control over the northern trade routes, and a psychological shock. It's like losing your main intellectual property and your primary distribution center in one go. So, what is happening to all that legendary gold during this period of slow decline, which stretches through the late 14th and into the 15th centuries? It's not as if someone found a giant drain plug under Niani and all the gold flowed out. The process is more complex, a combination of factors. Firstly, the ongoing costs of empire are immense. Maintaining a large army, a complex administration, and a splendid court requires constant revenue. If that revenue starts to shrink due to lost territories and the tax income they provided, disrupted trade, or declining gold production, then the empire is effectively running at a deficit. You can't keep up the lifestyle of a global superpower if your income is dwindling. The gold that is still coming in is likely being spent on defense, on trying to quell rebellions, or simply on maintaining the increasingly challenged authority of the Mansa. Secondly, plunder is a real factor. When cities are sacked or territories break away, treasuries can be looted. The rising Songhai would certainly have benefited from capturing Malian resources. The Tuareg raids on Timbuktu and other northern towns would have involved carrying off valuables, including gold. It's the unfortunate reality of warfare in any era. To the victor go the spoils, and gold is always a highly desirable spoil. You can imagine caravans no longer carrying tribute to Niani, but carrying wealth away from former Malian strongholds. Thirdly, there's the possibility of declining output from the traditional goldfields like Bambuk and Bure. Alluvial gold sources, those easily panned from rivers, are not infinite. Over centuries of exploitation, the most accessible deposits might have been depleted, requiring more effort, more labor, and perhaps more advanced mining techniques to extract gold from deeper quartz veins or less rich deposits. While Mali certainly continued to produce gold, the sheer volume might have lessened, or the cost of production might have increased. Historians debate the extent and timing of any such decline in production, as direct records from the mining areas themselves are scarce. It's hard to get precise geological surveys from this period. One rather strange or sidelight detail occasionally mentioned in relation to West African gold is the belief held by some miners that gold was a living thing, that it grew or reproduced within the earth. If nuggets became harder to find, it might even have been interpreted in a spiritual rather than purely geological way. Perhaps the spirits of the land were unhappy. Fourthly, trade routes themselves begin to shift, albeit slowly at first. While the trans-Saharan routes remain important for a long time, the late 15th century sees the arrival of Portuguese explorers and traders on the West African coast. They are also interested in gold, and they offer new trade goods, bypassing the long desert routes. This Atlantic trade doesn't immediately supplant the Saharan trade, but it begins to offer an alternative, redirecting some of the flow of gold and other commodities towards the coast. You can see this as the early beginnings of a major economic reorientation for West Africa, one that will have profound long-term consequences. Mali, primarily an inland empire, is not as well positioned to benefit from this new coastal trade as some other kingdoms. So the lost gold of Mali isn't really about a single massive hoard that vanished. It's more about a gradual bleeding out, a dispersal through multiple channels, continued, though perhaps less favorable trade, the cost of a declining empire, plunder by rivals, and the slow reorientation of global economic currents. The immense wealth that Mansa Musa so spectacularly displayed was, in a sense, too visible. It made Mali a legend, but also a target. And like any legend built on a finite resource and human endeavor, it was subject to the erosions of time, competition, and changing fortunes. You might compare it to a famous family fortune that gets divided among too many heirs and squandered on ill advised ventures until generations later people wonder where all the money went. By the end of the 15th century, and certainly into the 16th, the Mali Empire is a shadow of its former self. The Songhai Empire, under powerful rulers like Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad, has become the dominant force in the western Sudan, controlling Timbuktu, Jenne, and the crucial bends of the Niger River. Mali still exists, but it has shrunk back to its Mandinka heartland, a smaller kingdom among others, rather than the sprawling empire it once was. The Mansas still rule, but their authority and their wealth are greatly diminished. The title Mansa no longer commands the same awe in the international arena. Are there tales of hidden hordes? Perhaps. Human nature loves a good treasure story. It's easy to imagine a besieged Mansa in a desperate last stand, ordering the royal treasury to be buried, its location shared with only a trusted few, who then perish in battle. Such stories are common in the folklore of fallen empires around the world, but verifiable evidence for such specific massive hidden hordes from Mali is largely absent. The lost gold is more poignantly the story of a lost era of unparalleled regional dominance and wealth. The gold itself didn't cease to exist. It just changed hands, changed form, and flowed into new channels, becoming part of the broader story of global economic history. Some of it undoubtedly ended up in European crowns and cathedrals, in Ottoman treasuries, or as the working capital for merchants in distant lands, its Malian origins long forgotten. One of the lingering scholarly debates concerns the primary driver of Mali's decline. Was it mainly internal factors, weak leadership, succession struggles, the unwieldy size of the empire? Or was it predominantly external pressures, the rise of Songhai, Mossi raids, Tuareg incursions, and later the shifting trade patterns? As with most complex historical processes, the answer is likely a combination of both. An unfortunate synergy of internal vulnerabilities exploited by external challengers. It's a classic chicken and egg scenario. Did internal weakness invite external aggression? Or did relentless external pressure exacerbate internal fractures? You find yourself standing now in a much quieter Niani, or what you imagine of it in these later centuries. The grand imperial ambitions have faded. The vast caravans laden with gold from distant mines are less frequent, smaller. The Mansa still holds court, but the international envoys are fewer, the pronouncements less earth-shattering. The air is thick with memory, with the ghosts of past glories. The epic of Sundiata is still sung by the griots, perhaps with an added note of melancholy, a reminder of a time when Mali was the undisputed master of the Sahel, its Mansas the arbiters of fortune, their coffers overflowing with the world's desire. The mystery of Mansa Musa's lost gold, then, is not one you can solve with a treasure map and a shovel. It's a mystery woven into the very fabric of history, into the rise and fall of empires, the shifting sands of trade, and the enduring, sometimes destructive allure of wealth. The gold was never truly lost in the sense of disappearing from the earth. Rather, Mali lost its preeminent control over it, and the immense concentration of it that defined its golden age was dispersed like dandelion seeds in the wind. Each fleck of that gold, now scattered across the globe, carries a silent story of a once mighty African empire that dazzled the world. You feel a sense of closure, not in finding a hidden treasure, but in understanding the grand, sweeping arc of this powerful story, a story that still whispers to us from across the centuries. Now, as our exploration of Mali's golden age and its fading light draws to a close, let the sounds and images of this once great empire begin to soften around you. The vibrant markets, the bustling caravans, the shimmering gold all begin to recede, like a dream upon waking. Feel the warmth of the Sahelian sun gently cool, replaced by the soft quiet of the evening. The distant drumming and the griot's song fade into a gentle hum, a soothing whisper that lulls you towards rest. There are no more mysteries to solve tonight, no more empires to trace. There is only the stillness of this moment, the comfortable weight of your blanket, the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. Let any lingering thoughts of gold and kings drift away like dust motes in a fading sunbeam. Allow your mind to become as calm and open as the vast desert sky at night, filled with countless distant stars, each a tiny point of light in an immense peaceful darkness. You are safe, you are comfortable, and it is time to rest, to drift into a deep and untroubled sleep. The stories of the past will wait. Hey everyone, tonight we're going to get a little bit pointy. We're diving into the surprisingly contentious, occasionally scandalous, and rather pokey history of an everyday object you probably used at your last meal without a second thought: the fork. Imagine yourself now, perhaps at a dinner table, effortlessly lifting a piece of food to your mouth with that familiar multi-tined utensil. It feels completely natural, doesn't it? An extension of your hand, almost. But for centuries in Europe at least, this simple act would have been seen as bizarre, offensively dainty, or even, dare I say, diabolical. Seriously, if you were whisked back to a medieval banquet and whipped out your trusty fork to tackle a hunk of roast meat, you'd likely get some very strange looks, and you probably wouldn't have survived the social fallout, let alone the questioning of your moral character for using such an unnatural implement. So, before you get too comfortable and drift off into dreams of perfectly spearable peas, take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. It really does help the channel out. And while you're at it, feel free to share your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from as we explore these quiet corners of history together. Now, turn off your lights, turn on your fan for some gentle white noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. You find yourself seated at a long, rough-hewn wooden table. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasted meats, herbs, and unwashed bodies. It's a far cry from your modern, sanitized dining experience. This is Europe, sometime before, say, the 11th or 12th century, and even well beyond that in many places. Look around you. How are people eating? Primarily, they're using nature's first utensils, their hands. Fingers are for grabbing, tearing, and conveying food to the mouth. It's a tactile experience. You can feel the texture of the bread, the grease of the meat, the slight stickiness of a honeyed pastry. For more liquid fare, there are spoons. Spoons have been around for ages, made from wood, bone, or metal. Their bowl like shape perfectly suited for soups, stews, or porridges. You see people scooping enthusiastically. And then there are knives. Everyone has a knife. It's an all purpose tool used not just for eating, but for everything else: cutting rope, whittling wood, self defense. At the table, your personal knife is essential. It's used to cut chunks of meat from a larger roast, often served on a communal platter, or a thick slice of bread called a trencher that soaks up the juices. You'd spear a piece with the point of your knife to lift it to your mouth, or simply hold the meat in one hand and gnaw, using the knife to slice off manageable bites. It's direct, efficient, and involves a lot of, shall we say, digital dexterity. You can almost hear the slurping, the tearing, the occasional grunt of satisfaction. Table manners exist, of course. Don't grab with both hands, don't talk with your mouth full. Try not to fling gravy on your neighbor. But they are geared towards a world of hand to mouth combat with your dinner. The idea of a small, individual, two pronged fork for conveying food from plate to mouth is largely absent from this scene in Western Europe. It's not that fork like implements don't exist at all. Large, sturdy, two pronged forks are used in kitchens for cooking, lifting hot meats from cauldrons, or by carvers at grand banquets to hold a joint of meat steady while they slice it with a knife. But these are serving tools, not personal eating utensils. You wouldn't see a row of these agricultural looking implements laid out at each place setting. It would be like setting the table with a collection of small garden hose today. Our story of the fork's controversial journey to the European table really begins further east in the glittering, sophisticated, and somewhat more refined world of the Byzantine Empire, the successor to the Roman Empire in the east, centered around Constantinople. You can picture the imperial court there, a place of intricate ritual, shimmering silks, and elaborate ceremony. By at least the 4th century, and certainly more commonly by the 10th and 11th centuries, small personal forks were being used by the Byzantine elite. They were often made of precious metals like silver or gold, elegant little tools for those who perhaps didn't want to soil their fingers or their elaborate embroidered cuffs. This usage in Byzantium is a well established mainstream historical fact. It makes sense. This was a culture that valued refinement and inherited many of the later Roman Empire's luxuries. So, how does this pointy little innovation make its way west into lands where fingers reigned supreme? The primary vehicle seems to have been through high status marriages and diplomatic contacts, particularly with Italy, which had strong trade and political ties with Byzantium. One of the most cited, though sometimes debated in its specifics, introductions occurred around the early 11th century. Imagine the scene: a Byzantine princess, perhaps Maria Argyropoulina, arriving in Venice around the year 1004 to marry Giovanni Orseolo, the son of the Doge. She brings with her a trousseau befitting her station, filled with luxurious fabrics, jewels, and, according to some accounts, a case of small, golden, two-tined forks. You can picture the Venetian court, a rising maritime power, wealthy and worldly, but still accustomed to more robust, hands on dining. And then this princess arrives with her delicate manners and her equally delicate eating tools. She reportedly used her little golden forks to pick at her food, disdaining to touch it with her fingers. How do you think this went down? Not entirely well, according to some chroniclers. One such prominent religious figure, St. Peter Damian, a rather austere and reformist cardinal, was scandalized by this display. He saw it as an egregious example of foreign decadence, vanity, and excessive luxury. This is a key weird detail, or perhaps sidelight condemnation that echoes through fork history. When this princess later died of the plague, Peter Damian reportedly declared it was God's righteous punishment for her inordinate delicacy and her use of those detestable forks. He essentially said, "See, God doesn't approve of forks." Imagine the headlines: Fork user smote by plague, cleric blames utensil. This divine disapproval, or at least the clerical interpretation of it, is a recurring theme in the fork's early European reception. The fork, with its two sharp tines, bore an unfortunate resemblance to a miniature pitchfork, an instrument widely associated with the devil. So, using a fork wasn't just seen as foreign or effeminate. For some, it bordered on the sacrilegious. God gave us hands, the argument went, perfectly good tools for eating. To reject these natural instruments in favor of an artificial, pointy metal contraption was seen as an affront to divine providence, a sign of sinful pride. You can almost hear the sermons thundering from the pulpits. Cast aside the devil's tines. Embrace the digital purity of God's design. It's a bit ironic considering how much wine was being consumed from chalices, also artificial implements, but consistency isn't always a strong suit when it comes to moral panics. Historians still debate the exact impact of these early introductions. Was Maria Argyropulina a lone fork-wielding pioneer whose habit died with her, literally? Or did she plant a seed that slowly began to germinate in the fertile, cosmopolitan soil of Venice? The scholarly debate often centers on whether these isolated instances, like that of Maria or earlier, Theophanou, a Byzantine princess who married the Holy Roman Emperor Otto II in 1880-972, and may have brought similar customs to the imperial court in Germany, had widespread immediate influence, or if they were just curiosities confined to very small elite circles. It's likely the latter, at least initially. The fork didn't exactly take Europe by storm after one or two Byzantine princesses showed up with them. It was more like a very slow, hesitant creep. Even in Italy, which was the earliest European adopter of the fork outside of direct Byzantine influence, its use was initially limited. It was often associated with eating particular types of food that were sticky, staining, or difficult to handle gracefully with fingers alone. Things like preserved fruits and syrup, or later pasta. You can imagine a wealthy Venetian merchant perhaps having seen forks used in Constantinople or in the homes of those with strong Byzantine connections, deciding that a small fork might be rather useful for spearing a candied fig without getting his fingers all sticky. It was a practical consideration for specific culinary challenges, not yet a wholesale revolution in table manners. Outside of Italy, the resistance was even stronger and lasted much longer. For men in particular, using a fork was often seen as a sign of effeminacy. Real men used their fingers and their knives. Fiddling about with a tiny, two-pronged implement was considered unmanly, foppish, and frankly, a bit suspicious. You can picture a brawny knight or a hearty German burgher scoffing at some bejeweled Italian dandy, delicately picking at his food with a fork. Look at him, they might sneer. He eats like a bird. Is he afraid to get his hands dirty? This association with effeminacy would plague the fork for centuries, especially in places like France, England, and the Germanic lands. It was a significant cultural hurdle. It's funny how gender norms can attach themselves to the most mundane objects. Nobody questions a man using a spoon, but a fork? Suddenly, his entire masculinity is on the line. The design of these early forks didn't help their case much either. They were typically small with two straight, sharp tines. They were good for pinning down a piece of food while you cut it with your knife, or for spearing a morsel and bringing it directly to your mouth. But they weren't great for scooping. If you tried to eat, say, peas with a two-pronged fork, you'd be chasing them around your plate all night. It was more of a stabbing implement than a combined stabber scooper like our modern forks. So, their utility was somewhat limited compared to the versatile combination of fingers, knife, and spoon. Imagine trying to eat a modern salad with just a tiny, two-pronged skewer. You'd be there for a while and probably end up with more lettuce on your lap than in your mouth. So, as you settle back, you can see the fork in its early European days, an exotic import from the East, viewed with a mixture of suspicion, disdain, and outright hostility in many quarters. It's a symbol of foreign luxury, a tool of questionable morality, an object associated with dandyism, and a rejection of good, honest, God given fingers. Italy is beginning to tentatively embrace it, at least in certain refined circles and for certain foods. But beyond the Alps, the fork has a long, hard road ahead of it before it can even dream of becoming a standard feature of the European table. The Battle of the Tines has only just begun. You can almost feel the cultural inertia, the deeply ingrained habits of centuries resisting this sharp little intruder. The journey from diabolical tool to indispensable utensil will be slow, uneven, and full of fascinating cultural twists and turns. So, while the rest of Europe is largely giving the fork the cold shoulder, or perhaps the back of their greasy hand, Italy is slowly but surely warming up to this tined interloper. You find yourself in Renaissance Italy, perhaps in opulent Venice with its Byzantine echoes, or Florence, the vibrant heart of artistic and intellectual ferment. The Italian city-states are wealthy, sophisticated, and increasingly obsessed with refinement, art, and classical ideals. This cultural environment proves to be much more hospitable for the fork. You can almost smell the rich sauces, the exotic spices from the east, the Parmesan cheese being grated. It's here, particularly from the 14th century onwards, that the fork begins to find its footing. It's no longer just an exotic oddity used by a Byzantine princess. Wealthy Italian families start to include forks in their inventories. They are still luxury items, often made of silver, and possessing one is a mark of status and refinement. You might see them at a banquet in a Florentine palazzo, gleaming discreetly beside a plate, ready to assist a diner in tackling a piece of fruit glistening with syrup, or, increasingly, a helping of pasta. Ah, pasta, that slippery, often sauce-laden delight. While some pasta shapes were and still are eaten by hand or with a spoon, you can imagine how a small fork would be a distinct advantage in gracefully managing a twirl of spaghetti or preventing a rich tomato sauce from decorating one's expensive silk doublet. Historians often point to the rise of pasta consumption in Italy as one of the practical drivers for the fork's gradual acceptance there. It's simply a better tool for the job than just your fingers if you want to maintain an air of elegance. The Italian Renaissance is also a time of burgeoning etiquette literature. Books on manners like Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, published 1528, emphasize grace, sprezzatura, a kind of effortless elegance, and refinement in all aspects of life, including dining. While Castiglione doesn't explicitly mandate fork usage, the overall cultural shift towards more controlled, less overtly animalistic behavior at the table creates a space for tools that facilitate such decorum. You can picture a young nobleman aspiring to be the ideal courtier, observing the habits of the most admired figures, noting who uses a fork and how, trying to emulate that sophisticated restraint. Using a fork becomes part of performing your social standing. It's not just about getting food in your mouth, it's about how you get it there. Now, this Italian fondness for forks doesn't stay confined to the Italian peninsula forever. The Renaissance sees a great deal of travel and cultural exchange. Artists, scholars, merchants, diplomats, and wealthy young men on their grand tours, a bit later, but the principle applies, travel to Italy and are exposed to its customs. You can imagine a French nobleman or an English scholar visiting Venice or Rome, attending a lavish dinner, and observing with a mixture of curiosity and perhaps a little disdain their Italian hosts delicately using these small, two-pronged implements. Some are undoubtedly repulsed by what they still see as an unnecessary affectation. Others, perhaps more open-minded or eager to adopt the latest trends, might think, there might be something to this. They might even acquire a fork or two to take back home as a novelty, a conversation piece, or a personal affectation. This brings us to one of the mainstream historical figures often credited, or perhaps burdened, with popularizing the fork in France. Catherine de' Medici. You see her arriving in France in 1533, a young Italian noblewoman, niece of Pope Clement VII, to marry Henry, Duke of Orleans, who would later become King Henry II of France. She brings with her a large retinue, Italian cooks, Italian fashions, and, according to popular legend, a collection of silver forks. The French court at this time is still largely a hands and knives affair. You can picture the scene. Catherine and her Italian ladies, accustomed to more refined Florentine dining, attempting to eat with their elegant little forks while the bluff French courtiers look on, possibly bewildered or amused. The story goes that Catherine's influence led to the gradual adoption of the fork, along with other Italian niceties like ice cream and artichokes, by the French aristocracy. It's a neat narrative. The sophisticated Italian queen civilizing the somewhat rougher French court. However, the actual extent of Catherine de' Medici's direct impact on fork adoption is a subject of considerable scholarly debate. Some historians argue that while she may well have used forks and her presence certainly amplified Italian cultural influence, the fork was likely already known in limited circles in France before her arrival, and its spread was a much more gradual process, driven by broader trends of Italian Renaissance culture seeping into France rather than solely by one royal trendsetter. It's like attributing the popularity of smartphones solely to Steve Jobs. He was undeniably crucial, but the technological and social groundwork was laid by many others too. So, was Catherine the fork queen of France? Maybe more of a fork ambassador. Even if Catherine and her entourage were using forks, the French, particularly French men, were notoriously slow and resistant adopters. For much of the 16th and even into the 17th century, using a fork in France was often mocked as an Italian affectation, foppish and unmanly. You can imagine satirical plays or poems of the time poking fun at mincing courtiers who were too delicate to touch their food. There are accounts of King Henry III of France, Catherine's son, and his male companions, known as the mignons, being ridiculed for their overly refined manners, which included their attempts to use forks. They were seen as decadent and effeminate. One contemporary diarist, Pierre de l'Estoile, described them as struggling to convey food to their mouths with these newfangled instruments, sometimes dropping as much as they managed to eat, all while contorting their necks to avoid soiling their large ruff collars. It sounds like a rather comical and messy dinner party. Look at Jean Pierre, a grizzled old duke might have muttered into his wine cup. He's fighting his fork, and the fork is winning. Across the channel in England, the fork was even slower to arrive and met with similar, if not greater, derision. It wasn't until the early 17th century that we see notable attempts to introduce it. One of the key figures here is Thomas Coriat, an eccentric English traveler and writer. You can picture him, a curious and observant man, journeying through Italy around 1608. He encounters forks being commonly used by Italians and is quite taken with the custom. In his book Coriat's Crudities, published 1611, he describes in detail how Italians used forks to avoid touching meat with their fingers, praising it as a clean and neat habit. He even says that he himself adopted the practice while in Italy and brought a fork back with him to England, intending to use it. How did that go for poor Thomas? He was widely ridiculed. People mocked him for his Italian affectation. The term furcifer, which literally meant fork bearer in Latin, but also had connotations of being a rascal or scoundrel, was humorously, or not so humorously, applied to him. You can imagine him at a dinner, earnestly trying to use his fork while his companions nudge each other and snicker. It's a tough gig being an early adopter sometimes. One weird sidelight detail is that for a while, some English inns reportedly even kept a fork or two for the use of Italian-affected travelers, implying it was a peculiar foreign habit, not for upstanding Englishmen. The idea of a communal weirdo fork at an inn is quite amusing. The resistance wasn't just about manliness or tradition. Some of it was practical. Early forks, usually with just two straight tines, weren't all that versatile. They were good for stabbing and pinning, but not for scooping. So you still needed your spoon for many things, and your knife for cutting. Why bother with this extra, rather fussy implement when your existing tools and fingers worked perfectly well for most meals? It's like someone today trying to convince you to use three separate, highly specialized remote controls when your universal remote does most things just fine. Plus, there was the not insignificant risk of injury. With two sharp, straight prongs, you had to be careful not to poke yourself in the lip, tongue, or cheek. Imagine the dinner table conversations punctuated by little yelps of pain. Oops, got my gums again. This fork is a menace. Despite the ridicule and resistance, the fork, like a persistent weed or a particularly catchy tune, slowly began to take root, especially among the very wealthy and fashion conscious elite who looked to Italy and increasingly France, once it started to succumb, as arbiters of style. Owning a set of silver forks became a status symbol, a way to demonstrate your sophistication, your wealth, and your continental connections. You might see them laid out at a particularly grand banquet, more for show perhaps than for consistent use by all guests. The very fact that they were rare and expensive added to their allure for those who could afford them and dared to use them. It was a way of saying, I am refined, I am worldly, and I don't eat like a common peasant. In Germany and other parts of Northern Europe, the story is much the same. Slow adoption, resistance, mockery, followed by gradual acceptance among the upper echelons of society. The timeline is generally a bit later than in France and much later than in Italy. You can picture stern German patriarchs grumbling about these newfangled Italian tools, preferring their trusty knives and fingers. The scholarly debate continues regarding the precise tipping point in each country. Was it a particular royal figure, a specific influential book of etiquette, a change in the types of food being served, or simply a slow generational shift in attitudes towards hygiene and refinement? It's likely a complex interplay of all these factors. What's clear is that by the mid to late 17th century, while not yet universal, the fork was no longer quite the diabolical or utterly ridiculous object it had once been in many parts of Europe, at least in elite circles. It was on its way, but it still had a way to go before it would be found in every household. The two-tine design was still the norm, making it a somewhat specialized tool. You can feel the cultural tug of war, tradition and practicality on one side, fashion and a new sense of civilized behavior on the other. The fork is slowly, painstakingly carving out its place at the European table, one tine at a time. The journey is far from over. The fork still needs to conquer the masses and perhaps acquire a few more prongs to become truly indispensable. You find yourself now moving into the later 17th and then squarely into the 18th century. The air in Europe is changing. The Renaissance has given way to the Age of Enlightenment, and with it, new ideas about reason, science, and yes, even social graces and hygiene are beginning to permeate society beyond just the absolute tippy top. The grand, sometimes boisterous feasts of the medieval and early Renaissance periods are slowly giving way to more structured, more, more polite dining experiences, at least among those who could afford to care about such things. France, particularly the glittering court of Louis XIV, the Sun King at Versailles, has become the undisputed arbiter of fashion, culture, and etiquette for all of Europe. What happens at Versailles, or is decreed stylish by the French aristocracy, tends to ripple outwards, influencing courts and wealthy households across the continent. You can almost see the candlelight glinting off the polished silverware, hear the rustle of silk gowns, and the murmur of carefully modulated conversation. And it's in this highly influential environment that the fork begins to shed its lingering associations with Italian foppishness and starts to become a non negotiable symbol of refined French dining. Once the French elite fully embrace it, its journey towards respectability is well underway. It's like a controversial fashion trend finally getting the ultimate celebrity endorsement. Suddenly, everyone wants in. But perhaps the single most important development that helps the fork conquer the European table isn't just a royal nod, but a crucial design upgrade. You see, those early two-tined forks were, as we've noted, a bit limited. Good for stabbing, not so great for much else. Imagine the frustration of trying to eat early versions of mashed potatoes or a saucy ragu with just two sharp prongs. It would be an exercise in futility, or at least extreme patience. Sometime in the late 17th or early 18th century, probably starting in France, cutlers begin to experiment. They add a third tine. Better, more stable for holding food, a little better for scooping. And then the breakthrough, a fourth tine. And crucially, the tines begin to be gently curved. This is the game changer. Suddenly, the fork is no longer just a miniature spear. With four curved tines, it can not only secure a piece of meat, but also effectively scoop up softer foods like vegetables or even a bit of sauce. It becomes a much more versatile, much more user friendly tool. You can picture an artisan cutler, perhaps after one too many complaints from a wealthy patron about peas rolling off their fork, having a light bulb moment. What if we bent them and added another one? This evolution from a two pronged skewer to a four pronged curved implement is a key mainstream historical fact in the fork's journey to ubiquity. This improved design makes all the difference. The fork is now genuinely useful, not just a symbol of affected delicacy. And this increased utility coincides beautifully with those burgeoning Enlightenment ideals about cleanliness and refinement. The idea of everyone dipping their unwashed hands into communal bowls or gnawing meat directly from a shared joint starts to seem a bit, well, unhygienic and uncivilized to the increasingly fastidious sensibilities of the age. The fork offers a way to eat with more distance, more control, and less direct contact with the food. You can almost hear a sigh of relief from the germaphobes of the 18th century if they'd known what germs were. They just knew it felt cleaner. As the fork becomes more practical and more fashionable, demand grows. This in turn leads to increased production. While elaborate silver and gold forks remain the preserve of the aristocracy and the very wealthy, simpler versions made from less precious metals like steel and iron or even pewter begin to be produced. This makes forks more accessible to the burgeoning middle classes, the merchants, lawyers, and prosperous artisans who are eager to emulate the manners and lifestyle of the nobility. Owning a set of forks, even modest ones, becomes a sign that you are part of polite society, that you understand the proper way to conduct yourself at the table. You can imagine a rising merchant family proudly setting their table with their newly acquired forks, perhaps feeling a little self conscious at first, but determined to show their sophistication. With the widespread adoption of better designed forks, dining habits themselves begin to transform. There's less need to use your knife for every single bite if your fork can manage it. Food increasingly starts to be cut into smaller, more manageable fork friendly pieces, either in the kitchen before serving or by the individual diner. The old trencher breads, which soaked up juices and were sometimes then eaten or given to the poor or dogs, gradually disappear from more refined tables, replaced by individual plates. The full place setting with a knife, a fork, or even multiple forks for different courses in very grand settings, and a spoon starts to become standardized. You can picture the evolution from a simple knife and spoon to the tentative addition of a two-pronged fork to the confident array of specialized utensils we see in more formal dining today. It's a slow march towards cutlery completeness. One rather intriguing and somewhat peculiar utensil that appears during this transitional period is the sucket fork. This was often a small two-tined fork at one end and a small spoon at the other. It was designed for eating suckets, which were sweetmeats, preserved fruits, or items in syrup. Precisely the kinds of sticky foods that had first encouraged fork use in Italy. The sucket fork is a fascinating example of a transitional tool, trying to be all things to all people before the fork. Proper became versatile enough on its own. You can picture someone delicately spearing a piece of candied ginger with one end, then flipping it over to scoop up the syrup with the other. It's a bit like those sporks you get at fast food restaurants, a hybrid trying to solve a specific problem. Not a bad idea, but ultimately, specialized tools for specialized tasks won out once basic fork design improved. By the late 18th and certainly into the early 19th century, the fork's long battle for acceptance in Europe is largely won. It is no longer seen as diabolical, no longer particularly effeminate, no longer even a remarkable luxury in many households. It has become normal, an expected part of eating a meal. The arguments against it seem quaint, almost incomprehensible to people who have grown up using forks their entire lives. You might occasionally find very old-fashioned, rustic individuals in remote areas, still preferring their fingers and a knife, but in the mainstream of society, the fork reigns supreme alongside its old companions, the knife and spoon. The scholarly debate around this later period often touches on the interplay between utensil development and culinary changes. Did the availability of better forks encourage chefs to create dishes that were more suited to fork eating, like more delicate preparations, sauces, or individual plating styles like service à la française, where dishes were laid out and diners served themselves, evolving later into service à la russe, where food was plated in the kitchen? Or did evolving culinary fashions and a desire for more refined service styles drive the demand for better, more specialized utensils? It's likely a feedback loop, with both influencing each other. As forks improved, new dishes became easier to eat elegantly. As new dining styles emerged, the need for appropriate tools became more apparent. Imagine a chef proud of his meticulously arranged plate, despairing as a guest tries to tackle it with just a knife in their fingers. Mon Dieu, they need a proper fork for this masterpiece. So you see, the journey of the fork from a suspicious foreign novelty to an indispensable part of our daily lives was a long and surprisingly eventful one. It weathered accusations of being an instrument of Satan, a tool of effeminate dandies, and an unnecessary affectation. It endured centuries of mockery and resistance. But thanks to changing cultural values, a desire for refinement, crucial design improvements, and the relentless march of fashion, it eventually found its place. The next time you pick up your fork, take a moment to appreciate its humble yet hard won ubiquity. It's a small testament to how even the most ordinary objects can have extraordinary histories. You no longer have to worry about being smote by plague for using it, which is, you have to admit, a significant improvement in dining related divine retribution. Now, as our exploration of the fork's fascinating and sometimes spiky history comes to an end, allow the images of bustling Renaissance courts, skeptical English diners, and innovative French cutlers to gently fade from your mind. Let the clinking of silverware and the murmur of historical dinner parties recede into a soft, comfortable silence. Feel the weight of the day. Any worries or concerns begin to lift, replaced by a sense of calm and ease. There are no more debates about utensil etiquette to ponder, no more cultural resistances to overcome. There is only the present moment, the soothing darkness around you, the gentle rise and fall of your breath. Allow your body to relax completely, sinking deeper into your bed, feeling supported and secure. Your mind is clear, peaceful, ready for rest. The many small, pointed details of history can wait until another night. For now, it is time to let go and drift into a deep, restorative sleep. Good night.